The greatest theft in human history is not carried out at gunpoint, nor announced by decree, nor enforced by open chains. It happens quietly, patiently, day after day, until the robbed forget they have been robbed at all. It is the theft of time, of strength, of dignity, of life itself, and it is so slow, so normalized, that the victims are taught to call it freedom. Look around you. You are told you live in a world of choice, yet you must sell your labor to survive. You are told you are free, yet the conditions of your existence are dictated by forces you do not control. You are told the market rewards effort, yet those who labor the most possess the least, while those who labor the least command the most. This contradiction is not accidental. It is the foundation of the system itself. Capitalism does not steal in a single dramatic act. It steals through routine. Every hour worked beyond what is returned to you in wages is appropriated as surplus value. Every innovation that increases productivity without reducing labor time is turned not into liberation, but into greater extraction. Every crisis is used to discipline workers further, to lower expectations, to make exploitation appear inevitable. Over time, this slow robbery reshapes consciousness. What once would have provoked outrage becomes normal. What once felt unjust begins to feel natural. The worker enters the factory, the office, the warehouse with nothing but their labor power. They leave having created wealth they will never own. The product of their hands confronts them as something alien, something owned by another, something that even dominates them. This is alienation not merely from the product of labor, but from the act of labor, from fellow workers, and ultimately from one's own humanity. Life is reduced to a means of survival rather than the expression of human potential. The ruling class presents this arrangement as eternal. They tell you there has always been inequality, always been masters and servants, always been winners and losers. But history exposes this lie. Every mode of production produces its own class antagonisms, and every ruling class declares its rule to be the final one. Feudal lords spoke of divine order. Today's capitalists speak of markets and efficiency. Different language, same domination. What makes this theft so effective is ideology. You are taught to blame yourself for systemic failure. If you are poor, it is said you did not work hard enough. If you are exhausted, it is said you lack discipline. If you are unemployed, it is said you are unskilled. In this way, exploitation disguises itself as personal responsibility, and the system escapes judgment while individuals internalize guilt. But capitalism cannot exist without labor. Every factory, every corporation, every empire of wealth rests on the collective work of the many. The power of the ruling class does not come from genius or virtue. It comes from ownership, ownership of the means of production, ownership of land, machines, and resources that should belong to society as a whole. This ownership allows them to command labor and appropriate its fruits. The working class is fragmented deliberately. Competition is imposed where solidarity should exist. Workers are divided by nationality, by race, by gender, by religion, by precarious contracts and artificial hierarchies. Exhaustion replaces reflection. Survival replaces resistance. A divided class cannot recognize the theft being committed against it, let alone stop it. Yet beneath this fragmentation lies a shared condition. Whether in factories or fields, offices or delivery routes, the logic is the same. Work more, earn less, and remain grateful. This shared exploitation is the material basis for unity. Class consciousness does not emerge from moral appeals, but from the recognition of common interests forged in struggle. The slow theft depends on passivity. It depends on workers believing there is no alternative, that resistance is futile, that history has ended. But history is made by human beings, and the same forces that concentrate wealth also concentrate workers. Capitalism produces its own gravediggers by creating a class with nothing to lose but its chains. Reform alone cannot halt a system whose purpose is accumulation. As long as production is organized for profit rather than human need, exploitation will persist in new forms. True emancipation requires transforming the relations of production themselves, abolishing the private ownership of the means by which society lives, and replacing it with collective control guided by democratic purpose. The greatest theft can be reversed only when it is named, understood, and resisted. When workers cease to see their suffering as individual failure and recognize it as collective exploitation. When labor organizes not merely for higher wages, but for power. When society is reorganized so that human development, not profit, becomes the measure of wealth. The slow theft has lasted centuries, but it is not invincible. Every system that rests on exploitation carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. The task before the oppressed is not to beg for mercy, but to seize history itself, to reclaim stolen time, stolen labor, stolen life, and to build a world where the wealth created by all belongs to all. Capitalism is not a system that imposes its injustices abruptly. It operates with a subtlety that is almost imperceptible, a slow, creeping extraction that takes hold of human life without the appearance of force. It is not the sudden seizure of property or wealth that defines its operation, but the ongoing, normalized depletion of what is most essential to the individual: time, labor, and dignity. From the moment a worker enters the labor market, their life is gradually colonized by the demands of profit, their energy converted into a commodity whose value is never returned in full to the one who produces it. The theft is not dramatic, not sudden, and therefore it is all the more insidious because it becomes invisible to those it exploits. People labor under the illusion of consent, believing that they are freely exchanging their work for wages. Yet in truth, they are caught in a system that systematically appropriates the product of their effort, transforming human activity into a mechanism for accumulation in the hands of the few. The laborer produces value far greater than the compensation received, yet the difference, the surplus value, is claimed as the rightful property of the capitalist. This difference is not a one-time event, but a daily, relentless process in which the worker is compelled to extend hours, increase intensity, and push themselves beyond natural limits, all under the guise of employment, promotion, or stability. Over time, the worker internalizes this arrangement as natural or inevitable. They forget that what is being taken is not a fair exchange, but the very essence of their existence. The slow pace of theft dulls the senses, anesthetizes moral outrage, and renders exploitation a condition of life rather than an injustice to be resisted. Capitalism's power lies in this invisibility, in the ability to make extraction seem ordinary, to normalize inequality, and to convince those who suffer it that it is the product of their own inadequacy rather than a structural design. People are told that hard work will yield security, that diligence will bring opportunity, yet the system ensures that the rewards of labor accumulate in the hands of those who do not toil, while those who produce are left with barely enough to sustain themselves. The worker's day is filled with activity, but this activity is systematically stripped of autonomy, creativity, and meaning, transformed into the service of objectives that are external, often alien to human needs. Labor ceases to be an expression of life and becomes a mechanism for survival, measured in hours, wages, and output, rather than the fulfillment of human potential. Time itself is stolen, measured not in the hours of living, but in the hours sold to another, hours during which the worker cannot nurture relationships, cultivate knowledge, or engage in self-realization. This temporal theft is perhaps the most insidious because it leaves no physical mark, yet it reshapes the worker's entire existence. Dignity, too, is systematically eroded. The worker is valued not for their intelligence, creativity, or humanity, but for their capacity to produce. They are reduced to a function, a cog in the machine, judged by output and efficiency rather than moral or personal worth. Every directive, every performance target, every hierarchical control reinforces the sense that human life is secondary to profit, that personal needs are subordinate to accumulation, and that identity itself is contingent on submission to the demands of another. Gradually, the worker internalizes this hierarchy, learning to equate self-worth with productivity, and to accept exploitation as a natural condition rather than a social arrangement that can be challenged. Capitalism, therefore, is not merely an economic system but a regime of social control, shaping consciousness while extracting material value. The slow, imperceptible nature of this theft allows it to persist generation after generation, creating a society in which inequality becomes habitual, exploitation becomes moralized, and the working class is trained to live within constraints that are neither chosen nor necessary. Those who suffer it may not even recognize the full extent of what has been taken from them, because the system conditions them to measure success not by fulfillment or freedom, but by survival within the terms dictated by those who profit from their labor. Work becomes a rhythm of extraction, time becomes a medium of control, and dignity is exchanged for the illusion of participation in a world over which one has no real command. And the longer this process continues, the more invisible it becomes, until the very act of being exploited feels ordinary, natural, and even deserved. Under capitalism, the worker's existence is defined not by freedom or fulfillment, but by alienation, a condition that permeates every aspect of labor and life. The alienation of the worker is multidimensional, affecting their relationship to the work they perform, the product of that work, and ultimately to their own sense of self. From the moment labor begins, it is structured to serve ends external to the worker. The activity is not carried out for personal expression, for creativity, or for the satisfaction of human needs, but for the accumulation of profit that the worker will rarely, if ever, benefit from. Labor, once a means of shaping the world and expressing human capability, is transformed into a commodity, an instrument through which capital asserts control. The worker's energy, intelligence, and skill are appropriated by another, stripped of personal meaning and converted into value that serves someone else's interests. In this process, the act of labor becomes alien, a task performed under compulsion, disconnected from the worker's own desires or will. Every gesture, every movement, every hour is regulated, measured, and exploited, so that the worker loses the sense of authorship over the work itself. Work is no longer a reflection of human potential, but a mechanism of survival under the domination of those who own the means of production. Beyond the activity of labor, alienation extends to the product created. The worker pours time, effort, and skill into producing something that is immediately severed from them, transformed into property that belongs not to the maker but to the capitalist. The product confronts the worker as a foreign object, something that embodies their labor yet exists outside their control. It becomes a representation of power exercised over them, a tangible reminder of the value extracted without restitution. The worker cannot determine how the product is used, sold, or distributed. It is removed from their purpose and reshaped to meet the demands of profit rather than human need. This estrangement from the product ensures that the worker's labor does not result in satisfaction, fulfillment, or a sense of accomplishment, but in further reinforcement of dependence and subordination. The creations of their hands become instruments of domination, and the more the worker produces, the more wealth accumulates elsewhere, intensifying the sense of dispossession. Alienation reaches its most profound expression in the worker's estrangement from their own humanity. Human beings are naturally creative, social, and purposeful, yet capitalism systematically suppresses these qualities. Under the demands of wage labor, the worker's life is subordinated to external imperatives. Their potential is confined to functions that serve the interests of accumulation rather than the development of self or community. Labor becomes a means to survive rather than a means to express individuality or engage in meaningful activity. In this environment, people are judged not by their capacities, intelligence, or contributions to society, but by their ability to generate profit. The worker is reduced to a tool, valued only in relation to output and efficiency, and forced to measure their own worth by the standards of a system that does not recognize their intrinsic humanity. Social relations are likewise distorted, as workers are pitted against one another in competition, stripped of the possibility of solidarity, and alienated from the community that should support human flourishing. Human connections are subordinated to market logic, and cooperation, empathy, and shared purpose are replaced by rivalry and survival instincts. The cumulative effect of this alienation is psychological, moral, and social. Workers experience fatigue, frustration, and a sense of powerlessness, unable to reconcile the discrepancy between their abilities and the demands imposed upon them. Consciousness itself is shaped by this estrangement. The worker is conditioned to see exploitation as natural, to internalize the constraints imposed by capital, and to accept the reduction of life to labor as inevitable. The loss of control over one's work, over its products, and over one's own potential erodes self-esteem, diminishes autonomy, and instills resignation. The worker's identity is fragmented, caught between the human capacity for creativity and the relentless demand for productivity, between the desire for meaningful existence and the imperative to survive within a system that denies that meaning. Alienation under capitalism is not merely an individual experience. It is a structural condition, systemic and universal, emerging from the organization of production itself. It is reinforced by the social, economic, and ideological mechanisms that maintain private property, hierarchical control, and the concentration of wealth. It perpetuates inequality, suppresses resistance, and naturalizes submission, all while extracting the fruits of human labor for the enrichment of the few. It transforms human activity into servitude, creativity into commodity, and life itself into a resource to be exploited, producing a population of individuals disconnected from the work they perform, from the objects they create, and from the essence of their own humanity, a population whose labor sustains a system that systematically denies them the full realization of their human potential and whose daily existence is marked by estrangement, exhaustion, and a persistent, invisible oppression. Under capitalism, exploitation is not only material but also psychological, operating through ideology that disguises structural oppression as the result of personal inadequacy. The system does not rely solely on coercion, on visible chains or overt domination, but on the subtle shaping of consciousness that teaches the oppressed to accept their own subjugation as natural, deserved, or self-inflicted. Workers are conditioned to believe that their struggles, their exhaustion, their poverty, and their marginalization are evidence of personal failure rather than the product of a system designed to extract value from them. This ideological construction is one of the most powerful tools of domination, for it turns the victim into a willing participant in their own exploitation. From early education to mass media, from cultural norms to political rhetoric, the messages are consistent. Success is earned individually, failure is personal, and social conditions exist as neutral backdrops rather than products of systemic relations of power. The worker is told to work harder, to be more disciplined, to innovate, to be resilient, to take responsibility for circumstances over which they have no real control. These injunctions obscure the reality that the conditions of life, the availability of jobs, the wages paid, the security provided, the housing and healthcare accessible are dictated by structures of property, ownership, and class domination, not by personal merit. In the workplace, this ideological framing takes concrete form. A worker may be overworked, underpaid, and deprived of security, yet the narrative insists that promotion, recognition, and success are entirely within their grasp if only they try harder or adapt more efficiently. Failure to achieve these outcomes is presented as evidence of laziness, incompetence, or moral deficiency rather than a reflection of structural inequality. The capitalist does not merely extract surplus value from the worker's labor, they extract self-esteem, confidence, and dignity, teaching the exploited to blame themselves for the very conditions imposed by those who profit from their toil. The long hours, the dangerous conditions, the instability, the alienation from work and product, all these structural realities are rendered invisible by ideology, replaced with the narrative of individual responsibility. The worker internalizes this blame, turning their energies not toward collective resistance or understanding systemic causes, but towards self-reproach, self-improvement, and the futile pursuit of rewards that are limited and arbitrarily distributed. This ideological deception extends beyond the workplace into the broader social and political context. Poverty is described as the result of laziness, social dysfunction, or moral weakness rather than the outcome of unequal wealth distribution, lack of access to education, or exploitation of labor. Unemployment is framed as the consequence of poor skills rather than the structural requirements of profit-driven economies that maintain surplus labor to suppress wages and control the workforce. Health crises are individualized, the result of personal choices, while the social determinants of health, income, work conditions, environmental exposure are ignored. The ideology functions like a lens through which the social world is interpreted, distorting the view so that systemic oppression appears as natural law and human inequality seems inevitable. Those who benefit from the system reinforce these beliefs through media, politics, and culture, ensuring that critique is discredited and resistance is fragmented. The worker internalizes the judgment, believing that misfortune is a personal deficiency, that injustice is deserved, and that society is fair and meritocratic, even as their labor enriches the few at the expense of the many. Education, advertising, religion, and popular culture all participate in this ideological apparatus, teaching the principles of individualism and competition, glorifying self-reliance while concealing collective exploitation. People are taught to aspire to positions of power and wealth, but they are rarely taught to question the social structures that make accumulation possible. They are encouraged to measure themselves against the success of a few, and to see any inability to reach those heights as a personal flaw rather than evidence of systemic inequality. Even movements that appear to address inequality often frame solutions as personal improvement, self-help, entrepreneurship, retraining rather than addressing the structural relations that produce exploitation in the first place. By turning structural injustice into personal failure, ideology ensures the perpetuation of capitalism without the need for constant physical enforcement. Workers expend their energy not in struggle against the system, but in attempts to correct imagined deficiencies within themselves, while the material conditions of oppression remain unchallenged. This psychic manipulation is as powerful as any wage cut, as enduring as any law, and more insidious because it shapes thought, consciousness, and self-perception. Individuals may see themselves as free, autonomous, and responsible, yet their freedom is an illusion, their autonomy constrained by structures they are conditioned to interpret as personal obstacles. Ideology, therefore, functions as both veil and weapon. It conceals exploitation while compelling the exploited to participate in their own domination, ensuring that the system endures and that the theft of labor, time, and dignity continues unopposed, masked as failure, misfortune, or inadequacy, leaving workers exhausted, self-blaming, and alienated from the true sources of their oppression. All the while, the mechanisms of extraction and accumulation operate unchallenged. Class consciousness is the awakening of the worker to the reality of their position within the structures of exploitation and domination. It is the recognition that one's suffering is not the result of personal failure, chance, or individual weakness, but the consequence of a system designed to extract labor, accumulate wealth, and concentrate power in the hands of a few. Without this awareness, workers remain isolated, competing for survival within the artificial divisions imposed by the ruling class, unable to perceive the common cause that binds them together. The capitalist system thrives on this fragmentation, on the division of labor not only in the workplace but in consciousness itself, pitting worker against worker, obscuring shared interests, and promoting the illusion that inequality is a natural order rather than a social arrangement. Class consciousness pierces through these illusions, revealing the structural dynamics that underpin economic oppression and social hierarchy. It transforms the perception of exploitation from an individual grievance into a collective reality, making visible the mechanisms by which surplus value is extracted, human potential is constrained, and freedom is curtailed. Solidarity emerges naturally from class consciousness. Once workers recognize their shared exploitation, they begin to see their strength not as isolated individuals but as a collective force capable of challenging the structures that oppress them. Solidarity is the recognition that the labor of one is bound to the labor of all, that injustice experienced by one segment of the working class is a threat to the security and dignity of all. It is a social bond, forged not through sentimentality, but through material conditions, shared struggle, and the understanding that liberation is impossible without unity. This bond allows workers to act together, to coordinate their efforts, to demand rights and conditions that cannot be achieved alone. Strike action, collective bargaining, mutual aid, and organized resistance all depend upon this consciousness of shared interest and the commitment to act in concert. The power of solidarity lies in its capacity to confront the concentration of wealth and authority that defines capitalism. While capitalists command vast resources, political influence, and the means of production, their power is dependent upon the compliance of labor. When workers act collectively, they disrupt the mechanisms of profit extraction, challenge the assumptions of inevitability that justify inequality, and create the conditions for transformative change. Class consciousness allows workers to understand that their individual grievances are connected to broader patterns of exploitation, enabling them to move beyond isolated complaints to coordinated action. Solidarity amplifies the voice and influence of the working class, transforming disparate efforts into a coherent movement capable of reshaping social and economic relations. Education, dialogue, and shared experience play crucial roles in developing both consciousness and solidarity. Workers must be able to analyze the structures that shape their lives, to recognize patterns of inequality, and to understand the historical and economic forces that perpetuate exploitation. This awareness is deepened through discussion, collective reflection, and engagement with ideas that illuminate the mechanisms of oppression. In these spaces, workers begin to articulate their demands not merely in terms of immediate material needs, but in terms of justice, equity, and the transformation of society itself. Solidarity grows when individuals recognize their interdependence and see their liberation as inseparable from the liberation of others. It is reinforced by the successes achieved through collective action, which demonstrate the tangible power of organized resistance and the potential to reshape social relations. Class consciousness and solidarity also function as protective forces against the ideological manipulations that perpetuate exploitation. The ruling class invests heavily in creating divisions, promoting false narratives, and cultivating competition among workers to prevent unified action. Consciousness and solidarity counter these forces by fostering critical understanding, promoting mutual support, and nurturing collective agency. Workers learn to see beyond superficial differences, to challenge the narratives that blame the oppressed for their own exploitation, and to focus on the systemic roots of inequality. This awareness allows for strategic action that addresses not only immediate grievances, but the underlying structures that produce them. The historical record demonstrates that transformation is possible when consciousness and solidarity converge. Movements for labor rights, political representation, social welfare, and economic justice have all been built upon the realization that only collective action can confront entrenched power. The slow accumulation of awareness, combined with coordinated struggle, has repeatedly forced concessions, reshaped institutions, and challenged the legitimacy of capitalist domination. Class consciousness ensures that workers understand their potential power, while solidarity ensures that power is exercised collectively. Together, they create the conditions for sustained struggle, for systemic change, and for the possibility of a society in which labor is no longer alienated, exploitation is no longer tolerated, and human life can be organized around need, dignity, and shared prosperity rather than profit, hierarchy, and domination. In the absence of consciousness and solidarity, exploitation persists unchallenged, the working class remains fragmented, and the illusions of capitalism continue to dominate thought and action. But when workers recognize their common condition and act in unity, the foundations of the system itself are revealed as vulnerable and subject to transformation. True emancipation cannot be achieved through reformist measures, charity, or superficial adjustments within the existing system, because capitalism is built on the very foundations that perpetuate exploitation. The private ownership of the means of production and the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few. The system's logic ensures that those who control land, factories, machinery, and resources dictate the conditions under which others live and labor, turning human activity into a vehicle for accumulation rather than fulfillment. No increase in wages, no improvement in working conditions, no social welfare program can fundamentally alter this dynamic, for these are concessions granted by the owners of capital, not the realization of human freedom. True emancipation requires dismantling the structural mechanisms that allow a minority to appropriate the labor, creativity, and time of the majority. It demands that the productive capacity of society, the resources, tools, and institutions that sustain life be returned to collective control, so that society as a whole can decide how labor is organized, how wealth is distributed, and what priorities guide production. Without this shift, emancipation remains illusory, limited to temporary relief from the symptoms of oppression rather than liberation from oppression itself. Private ownership of production transforms human labor into a commodity, alienates workers from the fruits of their efforts, and concentrates decision-making in the hands of those whose primary aim is profit rather than human need. The capitalist determines what will be produced, how it will be produced, and for whom it will be produced, while the majority of those who create the wealth have no meaningful control over these decisions. Laborers are compelled to sell their time and energy not for the realization of personal or communal goals, but for survival within a system that measures human worth in terms of efficiency, productivity, and profitability. Emancipation, therefore, requires the expropriation of the instruments of production from private hands and their administration under democratic control, so that labor ceases to be a form of subjugation and becomes a means of expressing human creativity, addressing collective needs, and realizing social potential. By reclaiming collective power, society transforms the act of production into a cooperative endeavor rather than a competitive struggle, and wealth is organized according to shared priorities rather than the accumulation of capital by a privileged few. Collective control of production also enables the redefinition of value. Under capitalism, value is measured in monetary terms, in profit margins, and in the accumulation of assets, rather than in human welfare, social development, or ecological sustainability. Emancipation requires that society redefine value in human terms, prioritizing well-being, dignity, and the capacity for individuals and communities to flourish. When workers and communities collectively determine how resources are allocated, what is produced, and how labor is organized, production becomes a tool for satisfying genuine human needs rather than an instrument of domination. Education, healthcare, housing, and culture can be understood not as commodities to be purchased according to ability to pay, but as rights accessible to all, sustained through collective management of wealth and labor. This transformation challenges the very logic of inequality, creating a system in which abundance is shared, not hoarded, and in which the purpose of work is no longer exploitation but the fulfillment of human life. The abolition of private ownership is inseparable from the reclamation of political and social power. Emancipation cannot occur in a vacuum. It requires structures that allow collective decision-making, participation, and accountability. Workers, communities, and all those previously marginalized must have direct influence over the institutions that govern production, distribution, and social organization. This democratization ensures that wealth is not merely redistributed, but that the structures that generate and control wealth are fundamentally transformed. It prevents the re-emergence of hierarchical domination under new forms and creates a society in which authority derives from collective agreement rather than inherited or purchased power. True emancipation is therefore both economic and political, challenging the monopolization of resources and power simultaneously, because control over production without democratic oversight can easily become another form of exploitation. Emancipation also restores the humanity of labor. When production is collectively owned and organized according to shared goals, work ceases to be alienating. Workers engage in activities that are meaningful, cooperative, and reflective of their creativity and skill. The products of labor are no longer estranged from their creators. They serve communal purposes and contribute to the well-being of society. Time, energy, and intellect are no longer stolen under the guise of wages and surplus value, but invested in the collective enrichment of life. Alienation dissolves as labor becomes both an expression of human capacity and a pathway to communal development. Ultimately, true emancipation demands a revolutionary reordering of society. It requires the courage to challenge entrenched interests, to dismantle institutions that perpetuate inequality, and to envision a society in which production serves humanity rather than domination. By abolishing private ownership of the means of production and reclaiming collective power, society can transform labor from a mechanism of subjugation into a foundation for human freedom, social justice, and shared prosperity, replacing exploitation with cooperation, scarcity with sufficiency, and alienation with empowerment, creating the conditions for a world in which human life, labor, and creativity are valued as ends in themselves rather than as means to accumulate wealth. In conclusion, the slow theft of labor, time, and dignity under capitalism is not a mere accident of history, but a structural feature of a system designed to extract value from the many for the benefit of the few. Workers are alienated from their labor, from the products they create, and from their own humanity, while ideology convinces them to blame themselves for conditions imposed by a system they did not create. Yet within this oppression lies the seed of liberation. Class consciousness awakens understanding, and solidarity transforms shared struggle into collective power. True emancipation is impossible without dismantling private ownership of the means of production and reclaiming control over the conditions of life, turning labor from an instrument of exploitation into a source of fulfillment, creativity, and shared prosperity. History teaches us that the slow theft can be resisted, that exploitation can be challenged, and that society can be reorganized not around profit and domination, but around human need, dignity, and freedom. The call is clear: to awaken, to unite, and to act, for the power to reclaim life, labor, and humanity belongs not to the few, but to the many.